to the 7th Annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Jamie Monchik with the Wisconsin Valley Library Service. And thank you for joining us for our final session of the conference, the closing session, Self-Care Preventing Burnout. Assisting me today for this session is Jean Anderson with the South Central Library System, and we're so glad that you are here. Sarah Houghton will be talking about this, and some of you might recognize her name. She has actually presented at all 7 conferences, so hooray for her. And she's going to be talking about self-care. I think this is something a lot of us need right now and in the work we do. And I couldn't think of a better person to talk about this topic. So Sarah, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Sure. Thank you all for attending this afternoon, and thank you for having me yet again to speak about yet another weirdly disparate topic. So I thought we would start off by talking a little bit about what we mean by burnout. And the concept of burnout, I think all of us kind of inherently know what it is, but functionally it's this combination of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion that's caused by exposure to stressors, either severe stressors or prolonged stressors, or both. And I think all of us kind of have this cup of energy, and it slowly drains away, and certain things refill that cup, certain things take things away from that cup. And when you hit that point of burnout, you know it. And oftentimes when you're approaching burnout, people around you will notice before you do. So the World Health Organization does recognize work-related stress, and predominantly they see it as when the pressures that you're under are not matched up to the knowledge and abilities that you have, and that these pressures challenge your own ability to cope with the situation. And that stress can be worsened by 2 primary factors, which is a lack of support. That could be support from peers or people who are supervising you in an organization, and also a lack of control. A feel of a lack of control over a situation in and of itself makes that stress feel worse. So there's this survey that's done every year. It's been done since 1972, the General Social Survey, which I'd actually never heard of before embarking on this research. And in 2016, half of respondents said that they're consistently exhausted because of work, compared with only 18% 2 decades ago. So that's a huge spike in only 20 years. And to me, that's extremely troubling. And having been in the workforce for that amount of time, I can look back and say, yeah, I actually think that's pretty accurate of the experiences of myself, my coworkers, my friends, my family. I do think that that consistent work exhaustion has become more prevalent, which is not a good thing. So that state of burnout, it's not, you don't go from 0 to 60 unless you're in a severe crisis situation. Burnout really is a slow, prolonged process where you become less and less able to cope with those things that you're faced with every day. And those things don't have to just be work related. They can be your personal life, they can be the community that you live in, they can be friends and family. But work, because that is a bulk of where we spend most of our waking hours, has a lot to do with burnout. And it's often at the place where we feel we have the least amount of control as well, which, as we just said, leads to increased burnout. So this is kind of your individual phases of burnout. What we see organizationally is when everyone in the organization is burning out and has really gotten down to barely having any reserves left, is complete and utter institutional dysfunction, where people stop caring, people start calling in sick a whole bunch, people start leaving for other jobs. And so not only on an individual level, but at an institutional level, we need to care about this. We need to care about each of us as a human being who has this limited capacity to endure stress for a prolonged amount of time. And so it's in everyone's interests, from an entry-level position up into the big boss, to actually think about this, study it, and care about it. So why are we talking about this? Well, one issue is that burnout is real, and I think this is just in the last few years starting to become acknowledged in organizational psychology as something that people should be spending some time and attention on in human resources and other parts of organizations. We see burnout particularly in service industries where people are helping other people. So a lot of stress comes from people, no surprise. There are a lot of challenges that are specific to libraries. I think that because we are in a service and a care industry, we are expected to offer this huge range and number of services that seems to be ever increasing. And I think that our national failing social support structure has resulted in a lot more challenges with the people that we're serving. So if people who are experiencing economic challenges or untreated mental illness or substance abuse issues. And as with many fields, salaries are not keeping pace with inflation. So there's a total sense of a lack of fair compensation in libraries. And kind of lastly, I've noticed, and this is totally non-scientific, but I think it's true. People who work in libraries tend to be givers. We tend to want to do the best job possible. Sometimes we work for free. Sometimes we're willing to work unpaid hours in order to provide that best possible service for our communities. And that's a dangerous recipe, to take a high stress environment and a very giving personality and squish those two together. The truth is that self-care is the only remedy for burnout. And as I was looking at this with the slide deck with a friend, she said, that's not the only remedy. One of the remedies would be to quit. Well, you know what? Quitting is a form of self-care, depending on what kind of job situation that you find yourself in. And sadly, for many of us, self-care is often the last thing on our to-do lists, but it really should be the first. And I'm hoping that if you're attending today, it's because you care about this topic and maybe are willing to prioritize self-care a little bit higher on your own list, and to talk about it with your coworkers and your organization as a whole. So this was something someone said to me. This is someone who's a motivational speaker who I did not go to see speak, but who's actually a friend. And he just kept saying, stop existing and start living. I'm like, that's so, what a platitude. It's so meaningless and empty. But it is very true, where you get into this cycle of, well, that's just what the job is, so I have to endure it. That's what's expected of me or what I've been told I have to do, so I just have to endure it. And it's truly, that's not the case. You do have a certain amount of control over your environment, and if the environment is so toxic that you can't change it to be tolerable, then the truth is you need to find another environment. So how did I get here? I've always been one of those people who works more hours than you're actually getting paid for, which is not a good trait to have, but I've been doing that forever. I got to the point in about five or 6 years ago where I was working 80 hours a week, being paid for 40. I was doing the job of 4 people. I was a library director, an assistant director, a branch manager, and a children's librarian, all at the same time. I was burning the candle at both ends for years, doing those four jobs before I burned out to the point that my physical health was so affected, I had to take mandatory 2 weeks of basically recovery time. I enjoyed my work, but I had no life outside of work, and I was displaying all of the classic signs of burnout, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the more I felt, I think this is critical, the more I felt that I had to hide those symptoms at work and appear okay, the more those symptoms bled out into my few non-work hours and affected my circle of friends and family and loved ones. I did everything I needed to do at work, but at the expense of everything else in my entire life. I knew I was in bad shape and had asked my supervisors for help repeatedly, whether that was reprioritization of tasks or a temporary reprieve on some expectations or more staffing. But I was unfortunately in an organization that didn't provide any of those points of assistance. Our HR department didn't help. My supervisors didn't help. So on my own, and this is me opening up and being transparent, I began seeing a cognitive behavioral therapist once a week, and that helped me to release the pressure valve a little bit on those ongoing stressors, and also to learn some new techniques to cope with a situation that I didn't feel that I could change or control. And what I learned throughout that process was I had this conception that I was having disproportionate reactions to stress, that it was my fault. But the reality was that I had this never-ending stream of stressors, some of them extreme, coming at me every day. Everything from disciplinary challenges with employees to being followed home by a patron who threatened to kill me for banning him from our library. I was being advised by, I have a medical team, and the whole team was encouraging me to quit due to the extreme impact the job was having on my physical and mental health, but I didn't quit. I thought that a gap in employment would have a really negative impact on future job opportunities. So yet again, I made the choice to wrongly prioritize my professional work above my personal well-being. So instead, I realized this is not for me. I need to start looking for another job. It took me 2 years to find one that was a good fit. And I started taking better care of myself and knowing where I needed to draw lines to protect myself and my time. And with some of that time, I actually started researching self-care and workplace burnout because it had become a personal passion through my own experiences. So in short, really, I'm talking to you today because I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through. I want all of you to be smarter than me. None of us should have to hit rock bottom before we draw a line in the sand for our own physical and mental health. And I'm afraid, looking around me at my colleagues and peers, that a lot of us are getting dangerously close to hitting rock bottom. So what causes burnout, practically speaking? This idea of you've got these three factors: volume of stressors, velocity of stressors, and flat out abuse. And all three of those are present in any kind of library work. And these stressors can be physical, they can be psychological, financial, or even social. So some practical examples of what you might see in a workplace: overcoming nonstop challenges, from the smallest thing to the biggest thing, unrealistic deadlines, frequent scheduling conflicts, frequent interruptions of your work, which is pretty much the case for anybody who works in a library. Unpredictable schedules, again, very typical for library work. Physical demands, responsibility that you perceive as beyond the scope of what you're getting compensated for or what your role within the library is. And interpersonal demands, whether that be between you and a coworker or you and someone that you're helping in the library. So there's a theory that goes along with chronic illness that I think really crosses over into this idea of burnout and self-care, and it's the spoon theory. So for people who have chronic illnesses, the idea is, okay, if I give you 20 spoons for the day, and it costs you X amount of spoons to do certain tasks, if you have a chronic illness that already starts you off with fewer spoons than the average person has, it becomes a lot harder for you to do everything you need to do in a day and come out of that day still feeling like you have a decent amount of energy and that you've gotten done what you need to get done. And I think that crosses over into the workplace. If you're already burned out, you're already stressed out, you haven't gotten enough sleep, you worked 12 hours yesterday, today you're working 16, you're going to have a lot less ability to cope with those stressors as they're coming at you. And so if this is an idea that kind of makes sense to you or that you're interested in, there is a Facebook group called Spoony Librarians, and it's librarians with chronic illness who kind of commiserate and ask for advice and help. And it's a good place to get kind of practical advice of how to make that bandwidth work the best for you and to not misspend, if you will, spoons on things that aren't important to you, and how to prioritize the things that are. So not only is there this individual cost of burnout, what you feel for yourself, there's real costs to the library or to your parent organization. If folks are burned out at work, they're hugely reduced productivity. Every study that's been done has shown that. Reduced revenue, which isn't an issue for us, but you're maybe reducing the amount of times that you're able to get out and do outreach. Hugely decreased job satisfaction, which makes sense. If you find your job super stressful, you're not going to be satisfied with your position. Lots of absenteeism, sick leaves, a lot of people leaving. If it's a burnout type job, you're going to see a lot of people cycle through that position over and over, and that's a great indicator there's a problem. Perceptions of low morale, either within yourself or in the organization as a whole. You also see, and this is usually what gets the attention of the HR folks, is an increase in lawsuits for compensation, disability claims, other litigation regarding protected classes. And so just from a risk analysis assessment, you don't want your employees to be burned out because all of these bad things are going to happen. And the really, really sad thing that the research has shown is that employees who feel burned out individually become less and less inclined to help others in the workplace or to care about the organization as an entity. So they'll stop thinking of the mission and vision and values of your organization and the great things you're trying to achieve, and they'll stop helping other people purely out of a self-protective impulse because they're already at their wit's end. So it makes sense, but it unfortunately increases the problem dramatically. So there's a twist I want to throw into this, which is this concept of emotional labor. So this is a concept that typically in the research or in the pop culture articles about emotional labor, you will see people talking about, well, women do all the emotional labor and men do none of it. And I don't think it's that binary, but the reality is we do conduct a lot of emotional labor in work in libraries because the way it's defined is you're regulating your emotions, right? During your interactions with whoever you're talking to, whether it's a customer or a coworker. And that includes two things: expressing false emotion, so pretending to smile and be happy and cheerful, as well as suppressing emotion. So maybe when you're dealing with a really difficult person and you have some choice words you'd like to give them, you know you can't do that as part of your job, so you swallow it back and you remain pleasant and professional. I think all of us engage in emotional labor in libraries, regardless of role. And you can see it's, again, extraordinarily prevalent in service-based jobs, just as burnout is. And it's not just at work either. So if you have a home relationship or some other personal relationship that involves a lot of emotional labor, where you're either expressing false emotion or suppressing real emotion, that will increase the emotional labor output that you're engaging in. And you know, a lot of this emotional labor is completely invisible because we've become so good at hiding the roles that we play and the masks that we wear. But I do feel like emotional labor does play into how burned out we get, because it is stressful to deal with someone who's cursing you out, but all you can do is say, "Have a nice day, sir." You know, that's not a stress-free experience. There is a cost to that. So as I said, there is this real concept of gender and emotional labor, that there is a difference here. The whole concept started in sociology and got incorporated into feminine discourse, and it was just kind of accepted when this research started in the 70s that home and work situations typically had women performing the greater burden of emotional labor. And this author and activist named Rose Hackman, I think, had the best quote, which is, you know, what if much like childcare and housekeeping, some of this ongoing emotional management that largely women are doing is yet another form of unpaid labor. So that gets back to that whole, if you feel burned out and you're not feeling compensated, you're not feeling appreciated, you're feeling like you're having to act outside of your role or your designated role, that you're going to be at an increased risk for burnout. The United Nations recently conducted a study, and their report found that women do 2.6 times the amount of unpaid and emotional labor that men do, both in a work environment and in a home environment. And so there is something to this. And I think as we are a female-dominated profession, we are a service-dominated profession, this concept of emotional labor should play into the discourse that we have about burnout and about taking care of ourselves and not putting everyone else in front of us. So let's see, are you burned out? If you're attending, you probably have some concept that you might be a little burned out, or maybe you've experienced it in the past. But these are the technical signs of burnout in the workplace. Physical and mental exhaustion, depression, cynicism, just blanket cynicism about all things, not targeted cynicism, which I like to say is quite normal, but blanket cynicism, insomnia, forgetfulness, increased number of physical illnesses or mental illnesses, chronic anxiety, irritability, and finally, isolation, which is usually where most of us turn when all of the above have put us in this position of, you know what, I have nothing left to give. I need to just turtle up and protect myself right now because I am so close to having no energy left whatsoever. So there's this great burnout inventory. It's the Maslach burnout inventory, and this example was written specifically for physicians. And there are a lot of generic versions of this out there. I like the way that this one kind of specifies things that are particular to a particular profession. And I would love to see some more work being done in libraries using this inventory as a way to assess burnout in our organizations. So with doctors, for example, you know, if you look at the middle there, one of the lines is, I've become more callous toward people since I took this job. I think that's a question that translates very well over into library work. Working with people all day is a strain for me. I don't really care what happens to some of my patients. All of these questions are things that I think we could adapt very, very easily to the type of work that we do and really get at a true self-assessment of, am I burned out? When I look at some of these, there are things that I didn't really even think about. So the second item on the list is I feel I treat some patients as if they were impersonal objects. And that was really a coping strategy that I found I adopted as a library director, that instead of thinking of these very angry people in front of me yelling at me as angry people, I started to think of them as computer programs that were malfunctioning. And all I had to do was listen, debug the program, and make it better. And that was a coping mechanism, but it's an indicator of burnout. It's an indicator that I couldn't think of them as people and still function in that environment, in that situation. So, you know, that's a little admission of a not so healthy coping mechanism, but maybe some of these make you think about the way that you deal with things. Maybe you want to get out of libraries, or you've thought about it because you're just sick of it. You're sick of the work. You're tired of it. I think this, to me, is going to be, for me, the future where I want to focus my research is using this type of inventory and really specifying it to library work and seeing how we're doing, because I'm really worried about us as a group. So I think when we're looking at burnout specifically in libraries, you've got that conception that we all know about, we've all talked about, this stereotypical library life of, oh, it's so quiet and uneventful and peaceful and you get to read all day, versus the real life of working in a library, which is, it's like working in any other service industry, except we're open to the entire public, period, and people don't have to buy anything in order to engage with our services. So we have a lot less control over that environment and the people in it than others might. We definitely have physical stressors in libraries. I can think of, you know, setting up and putting away tables and just at that point just thinking, I mean, I got to sit down. I'm tired. that was 10 minutes of very heavy lifting that I now need to recover from. And psychological stressors, which I think is where the bulk of our stress is in library workplaces. Those frequent interruptions that I talked about earlier, that is the nature of the work we do, especially if you're on the front lines. You're supposed to be interrupted. And so there's a lot of work being done to think of it not as an interruption, but your whole job is to be interrupted. So don't think of it as an interruption. And that's a mental shift that not everybody can make. Libraries definitely have budget problems, we know that. And we definitely have workloads that exceed what we can do quite easily because everyone wants everything from us. We certainly have difficult customers. We certainly have difficulties with coworkers or management, just like you would see in any other field. And I think there is a lack of recognition and support for the hard work being done in libraries, not necessarily by the library managers themselves, but maybe by your city or by your county or by your patrons, a sense that you're taken for granted, as that doesn't feel good, and it leads to that sense of being burned out. So let's talk about some of the studies that have been done in public libraries. This was a great piece that came out about a year ago, and it was predictors of burnout in public library employees. So it identified some very specific symptoms, very much along the lines of what we talked about before: emotional exhaustion, cynicism, decrease in professional engagement. And the predictors of, are you going to be burned out? So regardless of whether you are or not, what are the predictors that you're going to get there? Do you have autonomy? Do you have coworker support? Is there pressure in the work? What are people's attitudes toward technology around you? And what are your recovery experiences? And by that, they were talking about when something acutely stressful happens, how do you recover from that? How do you take a step back and take a little time for yourself to bring that level of your cup back up a little bit? So all of these predictors, except for the technology attitudes one, correlated with burnout. And what they did was a multi-year longitudinal study. And the only factor that they found that was effective across the board in decreasing burnout in library staff and public libraries was if the supervisor consistently provided clarity about that person's role. So the supervisor would say, I hear you that you're stressed out about these 17 things. Your role is to only be responsible for and only need to be stressed out about 7 of those things. So if you had a supervisor who could do that for you and tell you, you know what, this is on me. Let me worry about this particular issue. This is not a problem you have to fix yourself. That would help decrease burnout. But everything else, whether the person was autonomous or not, whether or not coworkers were supporting each other, this study found nothing else was really helping. Which is a little discouraging, but we'll get to the more encouraging part in a moment. There was another study that was done in Washington State, and so this was statewide throughout between 2010 and 2012. And what they were looking at specifically was, how do we prevent burnout? How do we mediate burnout? We know it's happening already, so what do we do to take care of each other? And so the key thing after all of their studying of all of the libraries in their state found was that what really was essential, which matches up with the other study, is supervisor support and having some kind of policies and procedures in place that directly address psychological aggression. And so this was psychological aggression between library staff more often than it was psychological aggression from library patrons, which we all know is going to happen and we don't have any control over. But the more that they could create an environment where psychological aggression between staff members was not acceptable, there was a procedure for addressing it when it happened, and management set the expectation that that kind of behavior would not be tolerated, they found an increase in the well-being of the employees at those libraries, better family relationships outside of the library, more job satisfaction. And so I think, to me, the takeaway from that is we're kind of eating our own. We're eating our young. We're eating each other. We're not only in a stressful environment to begin with, but we're being mean to each other, and that's not helping things. And I can certainly think of examples of this from the 20 years I've worked in libraries where people have had the reputation of being, no, they're super mean. They're super nasty. You don't want to be on a committee with so-and-so. You don't want to work with so-and-so because they're cruel. They're nasty to you. And that one toxic person, if that behavior is allowed to continue, can often poison, 20, 30 staff members and increase their burnout factor incrementally, or exponentially rather. So I think that's important to realize, is that sometimes that management toleration of people being mean to each other is going to be a big part of the problem. So part of what came out of the Washington study was kind of looking at this workplace, what are we doing in the workplace? What do we have that are resources? What are we doing? What's happening with this psychological aggression? So it's not just, someone's aggressive toward you. You might see someone being aggressive towards someone else. And if you deal with that problem, over on the right column is like all the stuff that you can make better. So let's deal with that psychological aggression in the workplace, and let's support each other. And that will not only help the employee in the workplace, but both physically and mentally at home and in their personal relationships as well. So we've kind of talked about burnout. We've talked about what causes it, what the manifestations are like. So how do you address it? And it really comes down to these 3 pillars: taking care of yourself, taking care of each other, and making sure you're in an organizational culture that supports both physical and mental health and doesn't put it by the wayside, which many organizations do. So what's self-care? Well, in the most basic way of taking care of yourself, it's those small day-to-day decisions we all make about managing our lives, about what's going to take a priority, about how we're going to conduct ourselves. It is critical to make sure that your quality of life is good. If you're not taking care of yourself and you're only focused on taking care of others, you're not going to be doing so well. The term self-care, so the week after the 2016 US presidential election, it was Googled here in the US twice as often as it had ever been Googled in years previous to that. So self-care is not something that's isolated to the workplace. It's not something that's isolated to a particular personal situation. It can be societal. I wanted to make kind of 2 points as well about taking care of yourself. Self-care isn't selfish. You have to take care of yourself before you're ready to take care of anybody else. You can't function in an ongoing way where you always put yourself last. And I think as a profession that typically does attract people of a giving nature, this is somewhat anathema to the way our brains work. But coming to the realization that, you know, taking a day off and doing nothing but reading isn't quote unquote being lazy. It's taking care of yourself. It's recharging your batteries. And secondly, I wanted to point out really that self-care isn't a one-time deal. You don't just take care of yourself like, okay, I took my 2-week vacation, check for the year, I'm done. I've taken care of myself. Self-care is an ongoing process, just as your nutrition is an ongoing process, just as your mental health is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time deal. It's every decision you make every day in some way is going to affect how you feel. And keeping that in mind as you weigh your decisions and your options is going to help you be able to show up for work better and show up for your loved ones better. So even Cookie Monster cares about self-care. So just earlier this month, this is a great Twitter account to follow, by the way. So this year, Cookie Monster is going to focus on self-care, and when Cookie Monster needs a little love, going to get a cookie. Awesome. So this is not a concept that's completely, you know, just within the field of psychology or organizational management. Self-care is important, and it's bubbling up and becoming a part of our national discourse, including with Sesame Street. So what are some things that you can do for yourself right now? Well, first of all, I think one thing I would definitely recommend is identifying a list of what's most important to you in your entire life, the entire scope of your life. And ideally, how do you want to show up for these things? And how do you put yourself in the best possible state of mind to be able to show up as you want to for those things that are the most important? So maybe it's your children. Maybe it's your job. Maybe it's a community organization that you belong to. What are the things that are the most important to you? Thinking a little bit about your work environment. What is in your work environment that's either inside or outside of your control encourages a good state of mind, encourages self-care, encourages you being happy, feeling content, feeling peaceful, feeling safe. And what things in your work environment are working against those goals? That kind of an inventory can provide some actionable items that you can fix a little bit simply, in some cases, like, I'd really like to have a plant in my office and I don't. Okay, go get a plant, easy to do. Maybe it's our director is horrible and empowers the meanest of the mean people to be cruel to each other because she's conflict avoidant, and therefore the mean people are in charge. Well, that's harder for you to fix individually, and that's going to take some real organizational engagement to solve. Also, think a little bit about what you like doing, both inside and outside of work. What are things that you enjoy doing that you don't do anymore, or that you feel like you don't have time to do? Do you need to reprioritize and focus on some of those things? And likewise at work, are there tasks that just suck the energy and the life out of you? Are there tasks that energize you and make you excited about coming back to work the next day? And then finally, think about how you're debriefing from work currently, or detoxing as some people call it. So you're done with your workday, you clock out, you're going home. what do you do to take care of yourself to kind of, think about the things that happen during the day, think about the things you need to do the next day, and then let it go. And be able to show up at home in your personal life in a way that you want to, without letting work seep over into your entire existence. And if you're not happy with how you're doing that now, how could you maybe do that a little differently to make it work better? And I would encourage you, if you're looking at that question, to ask your loved ones or the people you do see outside of work what they see. How much of my work stress do you see bleeding over into our relationship or the discussions that we have? And what would you like to see me do differently to make this work better as a relationship for us? I think that those are important questions to have with those people who you care about. So there's some things that you can do regularly to really improve self-care in the workplace. One is protect your time. We're paid to take breaks. Take them, preferably take them away from your desk, especially your lunch hours. Choose who you spend time with as much as you can in the workplace. If there's someone who is particularly toxic to you, see if there are ways that you can, while still doing your job, avoiding being around that person. I will come straight out and say that there was someone at a workplace where every time I would even see the person, I would feel my stomach clench, just a terrible feeling, because I'd had so many negative interactions with this individual that I didn't want to be around the person. And once I drew a line and said, if I see that person walking down the hallway, I'm going to turn around and walk the other way. This is not a presence that I want in my life. It made my life better. Environmental factors. So looking, is your desk set up comfortable? Do you have plants or toys or whatever makes you happy in your space? Do you have any natural light, or are you under fluorescents or LEDs all day? Does the library have a pleasant scent? I'm going to guess no, because every library smells a little funky. So if you do have a workspace, is there a way you can create a pleasant scent that's not going to affect or interfere with other people, that can maybe just, produce some kind of a sensation to give you a moment of feeling good? It might even be just stepping outside and, sniffing a little bottle of lavender oil and then just taking a few deep breaths. And then protecting your personal space. So that doesn't mean have a cubicle and have chain link, and barbed wire surrounding it. But protect your personal space as you're interacting with coworkers, and your personal space as you're interacting with patrons. Just because a patron steps up nose to nose with you and wants to get into an altercation doesn't mean you have to accept that. Take a step back, keep more than an arm's length in between you and someone who's upset, always. Are you engaging in any solitary activities? Now, this is going to be different for everybody. So it could be meditation, and there are lots of different types of meditation. So I just want to, I'm very bad at the sit here and just do nothing meditation. I'm very good at active meditation, which means like walking or doing something at the same time as you're trying to clear your mind. Maybe for you it's journaling. Maybe it's having a better sleep schedule, or eating better, or loving yourself more and accepting yourself more. I would also encourage you to try to find a mentor. So look for someone in your field who you think does self-care right, and see what you can learn from them. Know your own limits and respect them. So if you know that after dealing with a particularly cranky patron, you're going to be basically irritable and nasty for the next 10 minutes, don't be on the desk for that next 10 minutes if you can at all avoid it. Get away from that. If you know that what stresses you out is committee meetings and the pressure to speak up, respect that and talk to your supervisor and strategize about ways that you can maybe not have 3 back-to-back committee meetings that are going to stress you out to the point where then you're burned out for the rest of the day. Also, try to decompress throughout the day. Don't just do it at the end. It doesn't work. You really do have to intersperse these decompressions. Otherwise, it does build up to the point where you can't completely replenish. And lastly, I feel like I almost didn't put this on here, but I did, because I can think of too many examples of library folks who do this. Man, you got to have a life outside of work. You can have, I am a library worker, I'm a librarian. That can be part of your identity. You have to have a life outside of that. You have to have an identity outside of that. Otherwise, your entire life becomes all of that stress you're absorbing all day, every day, and you don't have other things that will refill your cup and make you feel like your time on this earth is worth something. Another major issue is how to handle acute situations. So these happen every day in every library setting I've ever heard of. So if you're handling an acutely stressful situation, this could be a really uncomfortable discussion with a coworker. This could be your boss screaming at you. It could be you have to go interact with a teenager who's being loud and you just are uncomfortable around teenagers. It could be someone who's screaming and throwing a chair, trying to break a window. I mean, it could be any of these things. Acute situations happen all the time. The only two things that I have found that are helpful and that the research supports are focus on your breathing, really still listen to what's happening and, engage with the situation, but also focus on your breathing. Most of us tend to either hyperventilate or hold our breath if we're in a stressful situation. That's a normal physiological response, but it's not conducive to good thought, and it's not conducive to good health. And secondly, try to a little bit dissociate from the situation if it gets to a certain point by treating the interaction as if you were observing it in kind of a social experiment way or an appreciative inquiry way. And what I've found to be really helpful is, especially when you're dealing with someone who's not reasonable, which we know we all deal with, is asking questions. Like, okay, that's interesting that you just said I was a blankety blank. I'm really curious to hear why you would say that. Can you tell me more? And just treating it as a place to ask questions and not and by asking those questions, it depersonalizes it to the level where you're not taking it as personally, both physically and mentally. So it sounds really weird until you've actually done it, but I would encourage all of you to try this at least once and see if that helps put you in a better mindset in that acute situation. And of course, we have the aftermath. So this bad thing has happened, whatever the bad thing is, whoever it happened with, now what are you going to do? The things that tend to help people the most are taking a walk around the block, walk around the library, whatever. Just, clear your space, get out of the space that the bad thing just happened in. Read or watch or listen to something that's just plain old goofy. I know I've got some go-to sites for that it's just, okay, just put something cute and furry and fluffy in front of my face and I'll probably smile whether I'm really angry or not. Eat something that's weirdly healthy for you. So even if you're a normally healthy eater, eat something that's even super healthy beyond what you would normally do. And not only does that provide some good nutritional health for you, but it also provides this positive reward in your head of, oh, I did something I'm supposed to do, which is eat healthy. Good for me. Sometimes the impulse, I know for me, is to just, oh man, I just need some nachos or whatever your guilt food is. Do the opposite of that. Don't listen to that impulse. Listen to the impulse to take care of yourself better. Seek outside help, whether that means talking to your supervisor, talking to HR, talking to a lot of organizations have employee assistance programs that can connect you to an outside counselor, or have an ongoing relationship with a therapist or a counselor. And don't depend on a family member or a loved one to be that counselor. I think that's a trap many of us fall into, and it can really negatively affect those relationships long term. And stop trying to control your thoughts and emotions. I know, easier said than done, but you can't always control what your brain does in a particular moment or how you feel about something. But what you can always control is what's your response? What's your behavior? You can control those things. So your thought might be, wow, this person's telling me I'm stupid. Maybe I am really stupid. Well, okay, that's a thought that went through your head. It probably had some emotion with it. But your response to that could be, well, you're entitled to your opinion, sir, but I'm very confident that I am doing the best that I can for you and giving you accurate information as you requested. That you can control. You can control what you do in response to that negative stimulus. What can coworkers do for each other? Well, certainly watch for signs of burnout and stress in your coworkers. So look at that list from earlier in the presentation, and are you seeing this in people around you? Ask them how they're doing. Ask them how they're feeling. And if you think they're lying and saying they're fine when they're not, ask them again. Maybe ask them privately instead of in the hallway. But be persistent and be willing to listen if they want to talk to you about the difficulties that they're having. I will say there might come a point where you have a particularly upset coworker or complainy coworker, and you might need to draw some boundaries around what and how much time you're going to dedicate to listening to that person's problems. But on the fly, on the whole, be willing to listen to each other. If you can, even offer to help them with that situation if you can, or you have some ideas. Something that I've found, particularly in my new less stressful workplace, is creating these stress relievers for each other. So some things that we do here that I just find are small things. 60-second dance parties. Someone's like, dance party, and they have a little Bluetooth speaker and they play a really dancey song for a minute, and then everybody goes back to work. Anybody can do that. It's super easy. We've had pie day where everybody brings in a different pie. It could be sweet, could be savory, and we all eat pie all day. It's great. Have healthy food day. Write people little thank you notes acknowledging when they've worked particularly hard or they've done a really difficult task, or even, man, I saw you interact with Mr. Johnson and I know he's such a pain, but you handled that so well. Play a short game during lunch of any kind. Go for walks together. You know, all of these things can help. Definitely remind each other to take breaks. My administrative assistant in my last job would constantly remind me to pee because I would forget. I would just work. So he'd be like, Sarah, you haven't stood up in 3 hours. You need to pee. And I'd be like, oh, yeah, you're right. I do. Thank you. And it really took someone else stepping in and saying that for me to do that basic care of myself. Support each other in taking time off. So don't get grumpy when someone wants to take a 2-week vacation to the Caribbean. That's their time. It's okay. They need to take time off to deal with a family issue. Support them because you're going to want that support when it comes time for you to do that. Talk to each other about common workplace stressors and then role play through those key stressful situations that happen over and over and over again and come up with great ways to handle them and come up with those solutions together. And then the last item, really, you need to model the workplace culture you want to be a part of. So if you want to be a part of a collaborative, supportive environment where people respect each other and help each other, you need to do that yourself before you can start asking other people in your organization to do that. And that goes to the next item, which is, what can managers do? There's a lot of overlap here. Managers, number one, and this goes back to the research, making people's roles and responsibilities clear. And there's a RACI matrix. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, but it's a way of saying, okay, here's this issue, or here's this problem, whatever it is. What are all the stakeholders in this? And which of these 4 categories do they fall into? Are you responsible for this? Ultimately responsible? Are you accountable for pieces of it? Are you someone who needs to be consulted on these issues? Or do you just need to be informed of what's going on? And a lot of times people who are in the consulted role take on this additional personal responsibility of holding themselves responsible for it when they don't need to. And that can lead to burnout. Watch for signs of burnout and stress in the people you're supervising as well as your coworkers. Just like before, asking people how they're feeling and being willing to listen. Creating an environment where workaholism is not considered a virtue. There's a lot of research that shows that this is a generational change from baby boomers to younger generations where workaholism started to be encouraged. No, it's great. You're working 60 hours a week, 70 hours a week. You're exhausted. Good for you. You're the best employee. No, that's not the best employee. That's someone who is stressing themselves and other people out way too much. Don't take someone else's stress necessarily as a criticism of you or how you're doing your job. Work with people to make sure everyone is taking their breaks, everyone is taking their earned time off, and that is something that's supported throughout the institution, and it starts at the top. And if you do find that the people in your organization or you yourself think, oh, wow, our workplace is really bad, this is a not healthy workplace, find a workplace that is healthy, preferably a peer organization, and figure out why. What's the difference? What's the difference between your 2 organizations? Make sure that all of the managers and supervisors in the organization are trained on and are modeling professional, ethical, and supportive behavior. Make sure everybody's trained on conflict management and conflict resolution, as well as harassment and bullying laws, because a lot of that unhealthy psychological aggression comes from people who are not trained on how to deal with that in a professional context. What can everybody do? So regardless, I think we can build what that Washington State study calls a psychological aggression prevention climate, making sure that that kind of behavior is not tolerated. And that does mean endorsing and enforcing formal policies that do not allow psychological aggression in the workplace. Make sure that you have a code of conduct that defines behavior for all staff. Most of us have codes of conduct for behavior for patrons, but do we have that for each other? Most cases, no. Make sure that you have a policy that outlines what you do if there's a breach in that code of conduct, especially making sure that there's a safe way for people to report violations of that policy. Take every complaint seriously, investigate them seriously, and make sure that confidentiality is primary as you continue throughout that path. Make sure you're providing all of the support you can to anyone who's been impacted by that kind of behavior, and provide yearly supervisory and managerial risk assessments of how you're doing. Are we doing better? Are we doing worse? Making sure that we are creating a healthy psychological climate to work in. So really, it becomes this state of, okay, we're all a team. You're torn between work. You're torn between yourself. But you have to find some good balance between those two to have a happy balance between work and home. And I think that's the difficult part, is that formula is going to be different for every single person. There's no one right answer. So there are a lot of resources, and I'm going to whip through these slides really fast. That you will have access to a copy of this presentation. I would highly recommend the first book, Managing Burnout in the Workplace, a Guide for Information Professionals. If you're going to read one thing, that's the one I would read. There are a lot of journal articles about this in our field and outside of it. There are a lot of web articles where you can find, you know, the top 10 things you need to do to prevent burnout. There's probably 50 of those. It's ridiculous how much is out there. And at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions and hear what you guys have to think. And have to say. So thank you for your time.
Wow, thank you, Sarah. So as she mentioned, yes, her slides will be shared on our conference website later today. So you don't worry that if you didn't jot all those resources down. There's been a lot of comments in the chat area that Jean has been sharing. Someone asked about, someone said, I really need to learn how to debrief from work. Will this be discussed? Sarah, any thoughts or advice on that? How, especially as a former library director, how do you debrief on your job?
I sucked at it. So here's what I learned. For me, I used to have a long commute, about an hour and a half each way. And I would use that time to listen to audiobooks or listen to radio. And that became kind of this semi-thoughtless debriefing time. And obviously focused on driving and not killing myself or anyone else, but the commute became my debriefing time. And when I became a library director, my commute got cut down from an hour and a half drive each way to a 5-minute walk each way. And so there was no division in space or time between my work and my home life. And I think that was the biggest problem I had, was that I did not create some kind of buffer zone. Now, it doesn't have to be a commute. I have a commute again, and I am finding that to work for me. But maybe it's taking a half-mile walk before you go home. Maybe it's, going out and getting a snack wherever before you head home. Maybe it's running an errand, but creating some kind of space and or time buffer between home and work. And also having a safe group of colleagues or friends that you can talk to about certain issues without overwhelming everybody and stressing everybody else out. But having a place where you can say, dude, these 3 things happen a day, and I just need someone to tell me I'm not crazy. Having that cohort of supporters can really help bring you back to center and take some of that debriefing off. It's like, okay, that's what I needed. I just needed someone to tell me that those were stressful things, and that affirmation is enough for me to go forward.
Great. Another comment came in. Library managers seem to want to avoid ever firing a staffer, even if he or she is a major problem. Can you talk a little bit about the effect that can have, that negative staffer can have not just on the environment, but on the self-care of the rest of the employees.
Absolutely. I mean, one toxic person can mess up an entire workplace. I've seen that happen more than once, and not just their immediate team, but literally an entire workplace. I think that before I became a supervisor, which is going back a ways, I had the impression that people just didn't want to fire bad people. That was always the problem. It was just they don't like conflict. They don't want to deal with firing this person. So, it's the manager's fault. I think that is true sometimes. I think sometimes it's also true that it's friggin' hard to fire somebody. Depending on what kind of agreements you have with your workforce, it might take 7 years of documentation before you legally are justified per your organization's requirements to fire somebody. And so as someone who took that very seriously as a library director and did try to force some people out because their bad behavior was impacting others, I can say I had people with tons of reasons that they should have been fired, but our legal department wouldn't let me. And so sometimes it's the system itself that's broken, not just the player, not just this particular manager. I do think what I would encourage people to do is if you're talking to your manager or HR, whoever, about the effects that this negative person is having, speak about the impact it's having on you. Talk about, this person makes me feel this way. This person does this thing, and here's how it impacts me. And likewise, if you are a supervisor or a manager with one of these toxic people, explain that to them. Tell them what the impact that they're having on their coworkers through their behavior. Sometimes, not all, but sometimes people are just completely delusional and lack self-awareness of how their behavior impacts other people. I can think of one example of an employee who said, well, insulting people and calling people names was just the way my family made each other feel loved. I'm like, yeah, that's not a thing we do here. That's not a healthy adult environment. Right. So every time you call somebody a name, that's not making them feel loved. That's making them feel insulted and hurt. Do you get that? And sometimes it can be just that basic level of human misunderstanding that stands in the way between an unproductive and horrible employee becoming someone who you can at least tolerate.
We are just about out of time, but a comment came in, and I'm not going to mention who it was from, but I want to read this because I think it sums up what you talked about so beautifully. And this comment is, I've spent this entire session in tears. I am so thankful that you talked about this. I needed this. You truly stopped me in my tracks. I actually stopped running, which I love for more time to work. And tomorrow I'm going to start running. And I need to share this presentation with my staff and with my peers.
Wow.
So, on that note, thank you so much, Sarah, for a great session today. This was a great way to end our conference. And I want to thank all of you out there as attendees for participating, not just right now, but these last 2 days. And we always hope that you were able to take away some great things into your libraries. Believe it or not, planning will get started in the next few months for our 2020 conference. I can't believe it's almost 2020, which will be January 22nd and 23rd of next year. So from all of us in Wisconsin, we hope to see you in 2020. We hope you have a wonderful and successful year this year at your libraries. And please take care of yourselves. Look out for one another and look out for yourselves. So thank you for your participation this year, this week, and thank you also for all that you do. So long.